Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a while, but this is your Inept General bringing you another Total War Warhammer Legendary Lord lore video, and today we are doing part 3 of the Tale of Malus Darkblade. Now, I strongly recommend before watching this part, you watch part 2. A link will be popping up in the top right hand corner now, or you'll find a link down in the description below. Now, we left Malus after he has butchered the surviving members of his party, as they had reached their destination in the Chaos Wastes. There, Malus had become possessed by the demon Zarkan. So distraught and ashamed at what he had become, he felt he had no choice but to kill all of his remaining companions, as he could not bear to face them in his current weakness, and he could not risk at them guessing what had happened to him within the Temple of Zarkan. The demon that now possessed his soul had set him on a task. He had to gather 5 relics to free the demon, who would then set Malus's soul free. The first of the relics was in the Beastman camp, not far from the temple of the demon itself, and who Malus had just had a run-in with on his way to the temple. His companions, before he slaughtered them, had fought off wave upon wave of the beastmen from this camp, who were attempting to stop the band of Dark Elves from fulfilling their mission. But now, Malus stood alone. He approached his mount, his Cold One Spite, who was apprehensive and growling as Malus approached, recognizing something changed in its master. But just as it seemed the Cold One was about to snap at Malus, a howl was heard further down the path to the temple. Malus quickly took advantage of this and leapt upon Spite's back. The two charged down the road towards the waiting beastman horde, who had several times been fought back by Malus's companions and paid a heavy price for it. Now they saw one dark elf on its Cold One mount charging towards them, and the fear that had been implanted in their hearts by the fierce resistance of Malus's now dead companions caused them to break. Yagan, the Beastman champion, and his bestigors attempted to charge, but couldn't stop him through the retreating mob. As Malus made his way back down the road of skulls, the Highborn's mind raced, trying to force the horrors of the last hour from his mind in order to formulate a plan. Somehow he had to sneak back into the Beastmen camp and find where the Octagon of Praan was kept. He was sure that the only person who knew for certain where to find the relic was Kul Hadar, the Beastman chief himself. Slipping into the camp in broad daylight would be next to impossible. He would have to find a place to lie low for the night and slip into the shaman's tent when the opportunity presented itself. It wasn't long, however, before the retreating beastmen in Malus's wake managed to rally, and he needed to occupy them as well. He dismounted Spite and told his Cold One to hunt and wait for his call. The Cold One would both provide a distraction and perhaps allow it an opportunity to rest and heal its wounds. Malus then hid off the road nearby, and he watched the beastmen horde storm past, following in the tracks of his Cold One. Malus, seeing the beastmen go past, started to make his way down the hill towards the beastmen camp in a particularly self-congratulatory manner. But then, as he rounded a large boulder, he came face to face with a lone beastman, and the two collided. The Druki and the beastman went down in a tangle of limbs. Malus didn't know if the warrior was part of the mob that had been chasing him or not. He tore his dagger from its sheath and buried the blade in the beastman's chest. The warrior let out a bubbling moan and tried to hit the Highborn with his club. Malus took the blow on his armored shoulder and drove the knife again and again into the beastman's chest and neck. Within moments the warrior went limp, but already Malus could hear shouts coming from the direction of the road. Malus had to run. After a few moments, he found a dip in the ground that was partially covered by thick green ground creepers, and he lay prone beneath them, struggling to control his breathing, as a party of beastmen ran past his hiding spot. Towards the back of the group, however, there was a straggler, searching the area more intensely. He was drawing closer to Malus, closer and closer. The warrior had to have seen the creepers by now, Malus thought to himself. Will he turn aside? As the beastman grew closer still, he wasn't turning away. Furred legs thrashed through the thick bed of vines. A hoof sank into the vegetation a scant 2 inches from Malus's thigh. In a burst of movement, the highborn sat up, grabbed the beastman by one of his curling horns, and pulled him down onto the tip of his knife. The blade pierced the warrior's throat, plunging through and severing his spine. The beastman fell hard on Malus, spasmed once, and died without a sound. The highborn lay there, the beastman atop him, warm blood flowing over his chest and pooling in the hollows of his throat. As far as Malus could tell, the larger beastman completely covered the parts of him that weren't already hidden by the creepers. Once his breathing settled, Malus rested his head against the cold ground and waited for night to fall. Within moments, he was asleep. Malus awoke with a start, his breath misting in the cold night air. The body of the beastman had grown stiff. Dried blood crackled faintly as the highborn moved. He slowly, carefully, rolled the warrior's body off him and sat up, wincing at the stiffness in his limbs. The highborn looked around at the forest growth, and for a moment his exhausted mind did not know where he was or how he'd gotten there. But then the throbbing pain of his wounds penetrated his consciousness, and he felt the sense of emptiness in his chest, and remembered. He rose warily to his feet and tried to take his bearings. In the distance he could hear the sounds of the herd and the crackle of bonfires. It sounded like a solemn gathering indeed, Malus thought, with a merciless grin. Enjoy the bitter fruits of your victory, Kal-Hadar. You should never have tried to match wills with me. The problem was still present, however. How was Malus going to sneak past the beastmen? With the revelries ongoing, most of the beastmen were likely to be drunk. But still, he needed to find the way past them to reach their chieftain's tent. As Malus began to move, his feet hit off the body of the dead beastman, and as he looked down, a thought came to him, and the grin washed over his face as he pulled out his knife and stabbed it into the dead beastman's flesh. Wrapping the skin of the beastman corpse over his armor, Malus made his way towards the camp. Crouching at the edge of the woods, Malus scanned each of the 3 bonfires in the camp. Kal-Hadar was nowhere to be seen. But there was some good news. Less than 100 of the beastmen seemed to have survived their ordeal with the Druki. The highborn stepped from the woods and began his ascent to Kal-Hadar's large tent. He kept to the shadows, moving no faster than a walk, and tried to put tents and shelters between himself and the bonfires whenever possible. No one challenged him as he moved deeper into the camp. As he approached Kal-Hadar's tent, Malus noted that the smaller satellite tents were dark. If those belonged to Yagan and his champions, it likely meant that they were still out searching for him in the woods. That would make his task much easier. As he reached the chieftain's tent, Malus pulled out his dagger, quietly and carefully cut a slit in the hide long enough for him to be able to pry the leather apart and peer inside. There was a figure sitting next to an iron brazier in the center of the tent, facing the central door flap. He heard a faint murmur like chanting. Kal-Hadar was possibly praying to his gods for protection or deliverance, or to pass the blame for the defilement of the grove onto someone else. Malus grinned fiercely to himself and began to slowly widen the slit, cutting carefully in the direction of the ground. When the slit was large enough for him to slip through, he let the skin of the beastman fall to the ground and crept quietly into the tent. When the highborn was slightly more than an arm's length away, the sound of chanting suddenly stopped, and the horned figure tensed. Without hesitation, Malus leapt at the beastman, grabbing one horn and placing the dagger at the figure's throat. Not a sound, Hadar, or I'll slice you from one horn to the other. The cloaked figure let out a bleat of alarm, and Malus knew at once this wasn't Hadar he had caught. As sheets from the sides of the tent fell away, and Yagan, the beastman champion, and his troops poured into the tent, surrounding Malus, followed by none other than the chieftain, Kal-Hadar. Furious at falling for their trap, Malus slit the decoy's throat, who convulsed and bled to death on the floor of the tent. The shaman spoke up. When Yagan and his warriors lost track of you in the forest, He came to me and asked what you might do next. Hadar's horn head shook from side to side. I told him that if you weren't still running, it meant you might be coming back here. Predictable, Druki. Predictable. What I do not understand is why. Malus grinned wolfishly. I'm here to deal with you, Hadar. I'm looking for a talisman, something called the Octagon of Praan. I've been told you have it. The Highborn held out his hand. Give it to me, and I'll share with you everything I found in the temple. The beastman threw back his head and laughed. A coarse, braying sound. You amuse me, Druki. Here, I'll make you a counteroffer. Put down that knife and tell me everything you know about the temple, and I promise I won't skin you alive before I sacrifice you in a sacred grove. An interesting offer, Hadar. Let me think about it a moment, Malus said, and threw his knife at the shaman's head. Hadar knocked it out the air with his staff, but by that point Malus had drawn his sword and was charging across the tent. Yagan roared, and the champions rushed forward. One burly warrior made to grab Malus, and the Highborn gave him a backhanded swipe with his blade that severed most of the champion's fingers. As the warrior bellowed in agony, Malus reversed his stroke and ripped open the beastman's throat. Another of the champions lashed out with a gnarled fist that struck the Highborn just below his right temple. Malus's vision went red, and spots danced before his eyes. Another set of powerful hands grabbed the Highborn's sword arm and pinned it. The gnarled fist lashing out again, and Malus received another stunning blow to the head. His left arm was being grabbed and pinned back, and then when his vision cleared, Yagan was standing before him, brandishing his enormous battle axe. The champion showed Malus the cruel edge of both axe heads, and with a swift movement, he reversed the axe and drove the weapon's butt into Malus's midriff. There was a sound of crumpled metal, and an icy shock convulsed his body. The Highborn looked down as Yagan drew back the butt of his axe and pulled its 4-inch-long triangular spike from a hole it had punched in his gut. Dark blood bubbled out of the hole, and then the pain hit, wiping everything else away. They took his swords and armor away and beat him with their fists until his robes and cloak were soaked with blood. Blood still seeped from the wound in his gut, and the pain made any movement all but impossible. They lashed him to one of the thick poles in Yagar's tent, and the shaman questioned him at length about what he found in the temple. Malus told him everything. He even overstated the amount of treasure waiting in the room with the terrible crystal. Let the beastmen kill one another trying to get there. If the Dark Mother was kind, Hadar would actually succeed, and Zarkan would claim him as he'd claimed Malus. Hadar says he didn't believe a word and once again threatened to skin the Highborn alive. Malus just laughed at him, which under the circumstances was torture in and of itself. Soon he would be in the clutches of a demon for all eternity. What could Hadar do that would possibly compare to that? You do not have to die as of yet. The demon's voice echoed in Malus's head. If you wish it, I can heal your wounds. I can lend you great strength and speed. No, the Highborn muttered. No? You're refusing me? You would rather suffer as my slave for all eternity. Shut up! Malus hissed. A heavy blow rocked the side of his head. Pain exploded through his midsection, and Malus passed out for several seconds. When he came to, Hadar was crouching on his knees looking up at Malus. Don't die on me yet, Druki, the shaman grunted. We still have some things to discuss before you go up the slope to atone for your sins in the grove. Now, what does Zarkan want with the Octagon of Praan? The Highborn blinked slowly, trying to focus his thoughts. He wants to be free. The Octagon belonged to one of the sorcerers who imprisoned him. All the more reason to keep it from him, then, Hadar said. Praan was the great shaman who founded this herd many centuries ago. The talisman is one of the herd's most sacred treasures. Malus wasn't listening. His head had drooped to his chin, and a thin stream of bloody drool trickled onto the rug. Hadar pushed the Highborn's head back and thumbed one eyelid open. He's nearly finished, Hadar told Yagan. Take him to the circle. I must prepare myself for the sacrifice. You know, Malus, for all the carnage you have wrought, I look upon you as a blessing from the gods. Truly I do. You brought the skull of Erinlish, killed Machuk, and opened the gate of infinity for me. Now you have given me priceless information about the dangers of Zarkan and the temple. Knowledge I will use to approach the crystal on my own terms and bend the demon to my will. Finally, thanks to your foolishness, I will cut your throat in the circle of stones, and your blood will purify the grove you so recently defiled. He turned to face Malus as the champions prepared to carry him from the tent. I look forward to eating your heart at the bonfire later tonight, Malus. You have done great service for me and my herd. Hadar's deep laughter accompanied Malus into darkness. Malus left a trail of blood behind him the entire way up the hill. His limbs were growing cold, and his vision came and went. He had never been so close to death before. He could sense it, just at the edge of his being, seeping into his body like a winter chill. The demon spoke inside his head every step of the way, offering to heal his wounds. The Highborn savored the subtle edge of desperation mounting in Zarkan's voice. The demon might be telling the truth about his eternal servitude after death, but it was still clear to Malus Zarkan would much rather keep him alive. He also found it interesting that the demon couldn't heal him without receiving permission. What other limitations did he have? The thought quenched some of the pain Malus felt. It was good to have even a thin sliver of control over his own fate. It was Yagan and his 4 warriors who were carrying Malus up the hill to the sacred grove. Once they arrived, Malus noticed that the debris from the previous confrontation with the beastmen had been cleared from the sacred grove, and there were now a handful of priests around the area. The beastmen laid Malus on a sacrificial stone and didn't bind him as he was unarmed and near death. Once they'd placed Malus on the stone, Yagan and his 4 champions circled the grove, their backs to the Highborn. Malus carefully opened his eyes. The champions were standing outside the stone circle with their weapons grounded. Yagan stood off to one side, watching both his warriors and the activities of the priests. Zarkan, whispered Malus, the words coming forth in a faint hiss. You said you could heal me. Make me stronger. Faster. That is so. I can make you stronger and faster for a short time, but there will be a price to pay later. Do you wish it? Yes, Malus said, and hated himself for it. Black ice raced through his veins, freezing his blood and causing his wounds to burn. Every muscle clenched at the pain. His shoulders and legs came off the stone slab and hung there for several agonizing seconds. Then he collapsed against the stone, half delirious with the absence of suffering, and when his senses cleared, he realized he was whole again. Whole and powerful. He didn't want to think how much deeper Zarkan had sunk his talons into him after he'd made that request. He would pay whatever price he had to, and count the cost later. Malus slowly turned his head. He spied a large stone outside the circle, less than a foot from where one of the champions stood. As quietly as he could, he rolled onto his side and scrambled for it. It felt as though he was made of fine steel, light and strong. He all but flew the intervening feet over to the rock and plucked it from the ground as though it were a pebble. The champion was just starting to turn, his eyes going wide, when Malus took the rock and crushed the beastman's skull. The champion's eyes bulged and blood flew in a lazy spray as the warrior toppled to the ground. Malus had the champion's greatsword in hand and was rushing on to the next warrior in line before the first one had hit the ground. The next champion bleated out a warning and raised his axe as Malus struck, slashing the beastman along the midsection and cutting him in two without breaking stride. The highborn raced through an expanding cloud of blood and viscera and set his sights on the next, who had stepped forward and raised his sword to parry the highborn's attack. Malus slipped effortlessly under the beastman's guard and disemboweled him with a swift slash of his blade, then left the champion clutching at its guts as he sought out the last of Yagan's warriors. The remaining champion was running towards him, axe raised high. Out of the corner of his eye, Malus saw Yagan attempting the same, approaching from the side and a little behind the highborn. Malus focused his attention on the beastman in front of him, and then, without warning, the steel was gone from his step, and the attacking champion seemed to leap directly in his path. The highborn howled inwardly. "Cursed demon and your paltry gifts," he raged. "You asked for help. I gave it," the demon replied coldly. "Ask, and you may taste my strength again." Acting instinctively, Malus ducked left and swept low with the greatsword, just as the champion's axe plummeted towards his head. The beastman missed, and Malus's sword seared off the champion's right leg at the knee. The warrior toppled forward with a scream, and Malus took 2 steps past and then spun to receive Yagan's charge. Yagan came on like a bull, roaring a challenge and holding his axe high. "If he hits me solidly even once, I'm dead," Malus thought to himself. Without armor, the 2-handed axe would split him like kindling. Malus watched Yagan approach, waiting until the axe started to fall before dropping the point of his sword and ducking to the left. The axe whistled into the ground less than a finger's width away, and Malus took the opening this presented by raising the point of the blade enough to stab deep into the champion's massive right bicep. Yagan howled and swept the axe at Malus with a backhanded stroke that he barely ducked in time. Before the highborn could fully recover, the powerful champion reversed his stroke and slashed for the highborn's head. Malus ducked lower still and threw himself forward, this time digging the point of his blade through Yagan's thickly muscled thigh. Flesh and muscle parted easily before the sharp point, tearing a deep trench from front to back along the champion's upper leg. The highborn propelled himself past Yagan as quickly as he could, but not quickly enough. Another lightning-fast backhand stroke made a glancing blow on Malus's right shoulder, making a deep, painful cut. Blood poured in a hot stream down his arm, and the highborn stumbled. Malus gritted his teeth and spun to face the champion while he tried to plan his next move. Again, Yagan dictated the exchange, rushing forward and knocking Malus's sword aside with a powerful blow that nearly wrenched the blade from the highborn's hands. But instead of remaining still, Malus rushed forward as well. When Yagan's backhand swing came again, the highborn was inside the weapon's arch and could not make contact. Again, Malus threw himself past Yagan, and again chopped at the champion's thigh in passing. Blood now poured down the beastman's leg. Yagan turned about and rushed again almost immediately, but he was slower now, and his swing a tiny bit less powerful. As he charged, Malus spun and suddenly thrust his sword at the beastman's face, causing the champion to check his advance instinctively. As soon as he did, Malus dropped the point of the sword and buried it deep in the champion's wounded thigh. This time, the leg collapsed out from under the beastman. As he fell, Malus raised his blade and rushed in, bringing it down on Yagan's outflung left arm. The heavy blade chopped nearly through the thick limb, leaving it hanging by a thin strip of muscle. Yagan let out a bellow of anguish and fell forwards in a pool of his own blood. Yet despite his terrible wounds, the champion tried to push himself back upright with his one working arm. Malus raised his sword and spared the champion further anguish. The blade sang against flesh and bone, and Yagan's head went bouncing down the steep mountain slope. Having witnessed this slaughter, a chorus of bleating yells went up from the priests in the sacred grove as they began to flee the chamber. This followed moments later by the answered calls from the camp below. It was only a matter of time now, Malus knew, before they were all upon him. Malus looked around the grove and was glad they'd taken him to this place, for where else would they keep this sacred relic but in their most sacred place? There was a cave at the end of the grove, and Malus made his way towards it, gripping the bloody beastman sword he had been using, certain that that's where his prize lay. 2 priests were hiding just beyond the cave mouth. Malus stabbed one through the chest, and the other pushed past him and ran braying out of the grove. The passage of the cave ran for more than 50 yards in more or less a straight line. The further Malus went, the more he began to notice old discarded bones, many cracked for the marrow within, and the stench of rotting meat. A guardian? Malus thought sourly. But what sort of guardian, and where is it hiding? More importantly, does it sense my presence? The passage appeared to end in another small cave, lit this time by a glowing crystal that had been placed in an iron brazier, instead of growing straight into the ground. In the pale glow, Malus could see a broad shelf of natural stone along a far wall of the chamber. Resting on that shelf, and gleaming in a greenish glow, sat a large octagonal medallion, made from brass and affixed to a long chain. Runes covered the surface of the medallion, hinting at the power locked within. Yes, that's it. The Octagon of Praan. Seize it, urged the demon. But Malus was far more interested in the stench of rotting meat that hung in the air of the small chamber. He crept carefully and quietly to the threshold, and slowly surveyed the room. The highborn heard no sounds, nor saw any movement. That's strange, he thought. What is causing the smell? And then he saw the body of the stag heaped in a broken lump on the floor near the octagon itself. Its neck and back were broken, causing the body to be bent double in opposite angles from one another. One side of the magnificent rack of antlers had been snapped off and rested on the floor near the body. Both forelegs had been torn away at some point in the past, and the body rested in a black pool of rotting blood. Malus guessed it had been sat in the cave for a week or more. Perhaps a sacrifice, he thought? Though those marrow bones back there didn't crack themselves. The highborn surveyed the room again. Nothing moved in the shadows. Maybe there was a guardian previously and it was killed in one of the battles. The idea seemed plausible, especially since the chamber appeared quite empty. No time to waste, Malus thought decisively. I do know for a fact that Hadar will be here any moment, and I don't relish being trapped in a dead-end tunnel. Malus crossed the small cave, reaching for the talisman. When he was halfway across the room, something huge and hairy landed on his back and knocked him flat onto the rocky floor. A knotted club smashed into the middle of his back, knocking the breath out of him. Another blow hit hard against his ribs and sent waves of fiery agony shooting across his chest. The highborn tried to rise, only to discover that his attacker was sitting on his lower back and pinning him in place to deliver his blows. The club smashed down again on his right shoulder, and the pain of that, atop the cut he'd received there, nearly knocked him out. The attacker was in a perfect place to avoid the blows from the large sword in Malus's hands. Thinking desperately, the highborn reversed his grip on the sword, so he held it underhand and stabbed backwards as hard as he could. The point of the sword bit into flesh, and his attacker let loose a savage howl that set his hair on end. It leaped off him, and when it did, Malus raced quickly across the floor of the octagon, panting in pain. He tried to face his attacker, and his eyes went wide with shock. If the massive guardian of the Octagon had once been a beastman, there was little resemblance left anymore. The creature was massive, with huge broad shoulders and short trunk-like legs. The powerful muscled body was covered in irregular patches of fur, and the stunted misshapen head looks as though it had been made of wax and left half-formed. One bloodshot eye watched him intently. Malus had noticed the creature wasn't carrying a club. The damage it had done was with its fists alone. The guardian of the Octagon clapped a hand to the deep wound in his side and let out a howl. Without warning, it turned and scrambled up the wall behind it, alighting on a rough ledge of rock that sat above the cave entrance. For a split second, Malus thought that the creature was just going to sit there and lick its wounds, but soon, as it reached the ledge, it let out a snarl and leapt at him once more. With his back to the shelf, there was no place to run. Had Malus been a beginner in the arts of combat, he might have panicked. Instead, he set the pommel of his great sword against the rock shelf behind him and pointed it directly at the creature's chest. The guardian let out a wail, and Malus struck the sword at the point just below its ribs. The broad blade drove itself up until the crossguard in the creature's chest, spilling blood and bile in a torrent onto Malus. In the heartbeat before the monster's bulk slammed against him, he hit the rock shelf hard and gasped at the pain that flared across his back. Then the creature let out a strangled cry and grasped the highboard's head firmly in one enormous hand. The guardian's other hand tightened on Malus's shoulder, and then the monster started to twist. It was trying to twist his head off. Malus gritted his teeth and tensed his neck, battering the huge hands with his fists, but it was like the chicken fighting the hands of the farm wife. He grabbed at the hilt of his sword and tried to twist it in the wound, anything to force the creature to release him, but the monster only howled in pain and redoubled its efforts. Slowly, inexorably, Malus's head turned. Then it reached the limit his spine would allow. It started to bend further. Pain shot along his vertebrae, and his vision dissolved into a white haze. The highborn started to shout a single, long, painful note as he felt his bones continue to flex and wondered how close he was to the breaking point. Suddenly, the pressure eased, dropping off almost to nothing. Slowly and equally painfully, Malus straightened his head, and the guardian's body slumped to the side. Its melted face was ashen, and huge quantities of blood lapped against the highborn's boots. Uncaring, Malus sat down in the sticky fluid and tried to get his breathing under control. He'd been stabbed, cut, and beaten dozens of times, but he'd never had to suffer an attack like that before. "Get up," the demon urged. "Hurry. Kal Hadar could be here any moment." "Let him come," Malus snarled. "He can't twist my head off." "No, but he puts his faith in axes," Zarkan answered sarcastically. "Now go." Malus climbed painfully to his feet and reached for the octagon. "Put it on," the demon said. "Why? What does it do?" "It absorbs magical energy. Spells directed against you will be consumed by the amulet, no matter how powerful. It is a most useful talisman." Suspicion warred with desperation in Malus's mind. What if the demon was lying? Then again, he could not afford to take advantage of such a valuable talisman. In the end, he looped the chain over his neck with a barely repressed curse. The demon might not be telling the truth, but neither would he put Malus in a position where he could no longer serve his interests. With a great deal of effort, Malus recovered his sword and made his way back down the passage. His worst fears of facing Hadar and his mob at the mouth of the shrine turned out to be unfounded. They waited before the ruins of the stone circle, evidently unwilling to defile their sacred cave with further violence. Hadar had brought less than 50 warriors with him. Was this due to a lack of support, or had the herd had its fill of bloodshed? Those who stood with Hadar howled in anger as they saw that Malus was wearing their most sacred of relics. "There are almost 50 of them," the demon said. "You have neither armor nor mount. You will need my help if you are to prevail." "No," Malus said angrily. "I've bartered enough of my flesh to you today. You'll get no more. You'll die. Perhaps, and perhaps not. Now shut up and observe." Malus stepped from the cave. "It appears I won't be serving your herd quite so well as you imagined, Hadar. Remove the Octagon from your neck at once!" Hadar roared, and the rest of the true believers howled in agreement. Malus pretended to hold up the medallion between thumb and forefinger and study it intently. "If this trinket is so sacred and your faith so strong, why don't we put it to the test?" For a moment, Hadar didn't answer. The rest of the faithful eyed him expectantly, and the shaman knew he'd been trapped. "What do you have in mind?" Malus spread his hands. "What else? I challenge you. If you win, your faith is clearly superior and the medallion is yours. But if you lose..." Malus and Hadar locked eyes, and finally the shaman said, "It is not worth considering, Druki. I will not lose." The Druki grinned, "Then let us begin." "No, Zarkan raged, you fool! You set no terms for the challenge." "Terms? What terms do I need? While I wear the Octagon, his magic can't affect me, and I fear that stick of his less than I fear Yagan's axe. The advantage is mine, and besides," Malus thought grimly, "I want to be certain that whatever else may happen, Hadar dies by my hand. He owes me a debt of pain." Malus was already walking down the hill, sword held at the ready. Hadar shrugged out of his robes and hefted his heavy staff, his lips pulled back in a feral smile. "That's odd," the highborn thought to himself. "What does he have to smile about?" Then Hadar spoke a string of words, and the air seemed to warp around the shaman. His already imposing frame swelled even further, appearing far more powerful than before. Hadar roared like an enraged bear, and then barked out another string of magical words. By the time he'd finished speaking, he had crossed the 10 or so yards between himself and Malus. The next thing Malus knew, the shaman's staff smashed against his sword hand, and the great sword went spinning off into the grass. Hadar followed up with a backhanded swing that crashed into the highborn's chest and sent him flying in the opposite direction. Fetched up alarmingly close to the dark trees, his ribs throbbed as though he'd been kicked by a cold one. It took a moment before he could breathe again, and in that time Hadar was standing over him, striking down at his head with his terrible staff. Malus summoned all his strength and leapt away barely in time. "You lied to me!" Malus raged at the demon as he ran headlong for his longsword. "No, I told you exactly what Hadar's limitations were. His magic can't affect you directly. You were a fool who thought you knew better than I in matters of sorcery." Suddenly, a shadow fell over Malus, and instinct made him duck his head. Instead of killing him, the staff struck him across his shoulders and flung him face first to the ground. His entire left arm was numb from the blow, and his right arm throbbed in agony. Worse, he was now several yards downslope from where his sword lay. Realizing the danger and hesitating, Malus scrambled to his feet and staggered forward, his right hand running through the grass before him as he tried to find something he could use as a weapon. The faithful laughed to see their foe capering like a fool in the grove he'd defamed. Hadar stalked after him, summoning his power once more. "You were stupid to challenge me in my place of power," Hadar said. "Here, I can work my magics with impunity, drawing strength from the land itself. What do you have that can compare?" "Let me help you," the demon whispered. "I can give you strength and speed to surprise him. Just say the word." "No," Malus replied. The staff smashed down on him again, this time striking the highborn in the lower back. Malus cried out in pain and fell face first. His one good hand fumbled frantically through the grass, finally closed on something small and hard. Hadar rose above him, his staff poised to strike. "I had expected better of the warrior who'd bested Yagan. But then, the earth is not your ally." Malus rolled onto his back and snapped his right hand forward, fingers pointed up at the bottom of Hadar's jaw. The shaman had just enough time to register the motion before the small, charred boot knife punched through the soft flesh and drove upwards into Hadar's brain. "Perhaps not, Beastman," Malus answered coldly. "But from time to time, she supplies me with what I need. The shaman's engorged body swayed on his feet for the space of several heartbeats, then crashed to the ground. I thought that knife had landed somewhere over here, the Highborn thought, as he climbed to his feet. There had been logic behind his apparent desperation. While it seemed to Hadar's faithful, Malus was scrambling around, desperately looking for any old rock or twig to use as a weapon. He had remembered that during the earlier fight when the Dark Riders had invaded the sacred grove of the Beastmen, he had lost his boot knife, and it had been charred by the magical sorceries of Kal Hadar. There, he had found it again, just where he remembered it had been dropped in the earlier battle. Malus went and reclaimed his sword, ignoring the shocked cries and horrified looks of the true believers. Then, he turned on them, brandishing the point of his sword in their faces. "Hear me, animals! Your shaman is dead. Your champions are dead. Your relic has been plundered all by my hand alone. Your herd has been broken. Leave now, or try your faith against mine and perish, as Kal Hadar did. Now choose." The true believers stared at Malus for several heartbeats, clearly weighing their convictions. One beastman stepped forward, opening his mouth to speak, and Malus stabbed him through the throat. The rest fled, filling the grove with wails of despair. Malus watched them go. Once they were lost from sight, he let the greatsword fall to the ground and walked over to Yagan's headless body. Bending down, he picked up the champion's fallen axe. Then, studying the black trees of the grove carefully, he went to gather some wood for a fire. The fire warmed his bones, and the sweet juices from the meat of Kal Hadar's heart filled his belly. As the hours immediately after the battle wore on, there had been much shouting and howls of despair in the herd camp throughout the afternoon, but as evening wore on, the place fell silent. Malus wandered down from the grove itself, a great deal less demonstrative than before, and found the place deserted. He went through Hadar's tent and found it expertly pillaged, except for his belongings that sat in a neat pile on the dirt floor where rugs had once lain. Malus had armed himself, and feeling more relaxed at that point, went into the woods to find Spite. Having recovered his mount, Malus returned to the grove, where Spite scurried in and began helping himself to Hadar's fallen champions. He'd let Spite eat his fill, and then begin the long trek south back to the hag. The demon's voice still echoed in his mind. "Already, the sands are running from the hourglass. Even as we speak, your life is slipping from your grasp." He had the Octagon of Praan, but that still left 4 talismen to go, and he hadn't had any idea where to find them. And of the 2 people he knew who might have the information, one likely wanted him dead, and the other had actively tried to kill him by sending him to the wastes in the first place. "Your sister sought to teach you a lesson," Zarkan said. "If she wanted you dead, she would have kept you in the city, where Uriel could get to you." "You may have a point," the Highborn grudgingly agreed. "She may have expected me to turn back once the going became too dangerous." He grinned. "It appears my sister does not know me as well as she thinks." "Perhaps, but that assumption worked out in her favor, putting rest to a potential threat of betrayal. Simply tell her warband was wiped out on the journey north. It's nothing but the truth." Malus nodded. His expression was troubled. He'd lost a great deal many valuable resources during the journey. Some, like Lenara, would be almost impossible to replace. Yet the expedition hadn't been a total loss. He would return with enough wealth from the demon's treasure chamber to pay off his debts and begin forming the power base he'd always needed. "You are very free with my trinkets, Darkblade," the demon warned. "If I'm free with your gold, you'll be free in turn," Malus replied. "I can't search for your relics if I wind up on the wrong end of an assassin's blade." Zarkan fell silent. Malus afforded himself a brief, smug grin. And that about does it for part 3 of the tale of Malus Darkblade, ladies and gentlemen. In the next part, he shall be returning home with many threats to have to deal with. Join us for that part coming up. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, a huge thank you for watching, and I hope to catch you all on the next one. Alright guys, bye.